Okay, so I want to introduce Katherine Daniels. Katherine is a fellow one-woman ops team and understands the trials and tribulations therein. And I've had the pleasure of seeing her speak at a number of fabulous conferences, from Monitorama to Velocity Santa Clara, and I'm just so pleased and privileged to have her here, actually speaking to us at DevOpsDays Minneapolis, of all places. She comes to us out of New York, and she'll tell us a little bit about her organization there. And she's a huge fan of MongoDB. Ask her how. Yes, Definitely is web scale. Read the shirt. In any case, and I also wanted to let you know that Katherine and I, as well as Jen Davis from Chef, Samantha Thomas from the University of Minnesota, and moderated by Laura Swanson from Etsy, are going to be doing a panel at Velocity New York called A Woman's Place is at the Command Prompt. So, so I'm very much looking forward to that as well, and Katherine has some great stuff to tell us today. So without further ado, Katherine Daniels.
All right, thank you. Can people hear me? Yes? All right. So, my name is Katherine Daniels. You might know me from the Twitters as BeerOps. I'm going to talk today about how DevOps is dead. So, a little bit of background about me, so you know kind of where I'm coming from here. I started the relevant part of my career as a humble system administrator. I found myself thrown into a data center kind of on accident right around the time that DevOps was actually becoming a thing, but I didn't know about it back then. But over the next few years, I became known as a sparkly DevOps princess, and at Velocity, they even gave me a tiara. It was pretty great. I still get to do all of the fun work of arguing with computers and websites all day long, but now I'm in the cloud instead of a data center, so I don't have to, go hang out with actual physical servers, because who wants to do that? Sorry, there's wireless issues. Okay. So, that's who I am. Why am I up here saying that DevOps is dead? If DevOps were dead, I wouldn't be at a conference called DevOpsDays. Nobody would be talking about it or blogging about it or anything like that, right? So to explain what I mean, I'm going to talk about something called a hype cycle. This was developed by the IT research firm Gartner to describe how technologies are adopted and how they mature over time. I'm going to be using a slightly more generalized version of this, but the same basic principles still apply. So the hype cycle for a technology or an idea starts with the trigger. At this point, an idea is just, a potential breakthrough. It sounds good in theory, but it hasn't really been put into practice yet. For software or hardware, this might be, there's, some beta version, alpha version probably, but not maybe a real usable product. For an idea, somebody dreamed it up and it's just starting to come to life. And for DevOps, this trigger was sometime back in 2009. The first DevOpsDays was in Belgium in, I think, October of that year. And I think this was the first year that the term DevOps was really used. And DevOpsDays was really the first conference of its kind. For a little bit of a context of how long ago 5 years was, MongoDB was so on-web scale that they hadn't even released version 1.4. They didn't even make promises to, save your data reliably. And this Kanye West meme was still funny, so we've really come a long way since then. Patrick said in his blog after this first DevOpsDays event, "I'll be honest, for the past few years, when I went to some of the Agile conferences, it felt like preaching in the desert. I was kind of giving up. Maybe the idea was too crazy, developers and operations working together. But now, oh boy, the fire is really spreading." And back then, that idea really was kind of out there. This wasn't just some funny picture that we see on the internet. This was kind of how things were. Developers saw the sysadmins as grouchy and stuck in their ways, the bastard operators from hell who hated change and never let anyone do anything. Sysadmins saw the developers as reckless and irresponsible, people who would just throw code over the wall into production and then watch the servers catch on fire and burn. So what was this newfangled DevOps idea? And how How could it help? Jez Humble said, a fundamental assumption of DevOps is that achieving both frequent, reliable deployments and a stable production environment is not a zero-sum game. And this was kind of key to understanding the movement. Because before, the assumption was that if the developers got their way and got their code into production, that the servers were going to catch on fire and everything was going to be unstable. That meant that the sysadmins lost, or the other way around. So here's some new crazy idea where everyone can get what they want. It's pretty easy to see why that was so popular. So next in the hype cycle is the peak of inflated expectations. At this point, early publicity often includes several big success stories, the cool kids like Etsy who were doing DevOps before it was cool. They were way ahead of the game. There's also stories of failure, but people are still really into this idea, and it's magical and it's going to solve all of our problems. You could also say that this peak of inflated expectations was when people determined on Twitter that we had reached peak DevOps. This was sometime actually late last year, early this year. People were kind of, I don't know. There were some people who thought that DevOps was going to solve all of our problems, and some people who thought, maybe not. Just rub some DevOps on it, it'll be fine. It's gotten to the point where multiple people have been crowned sparkly DevOps princesses. It's not just me. When people are getting tiaras, you know that this is a really big deal. So now we find ourselves in the trough of disillusionment. Some people have tried to do DevOps and failed for whatever reason. Some people are just tired of hearing the word used, and more often misused. Especially people who kind of were around at the beginning, who knew the movement for what it really was, what it was really trying to accomplish, and not just some buzzword. And people started writing blog posts and giving talks to this effect. Like, you are not a DevOps. There is no such thing as a DevOps team. DevOps in your job title is doing you harm. I actually took DevOps engineer off of my LinkedIn because I was tired of all the recruiter spam that came with it. And it really did cut down on the spam quite a bit. Now I'm just an operations engineer, and people mostly leave me alone. It's pretty great. There are some people who would argue that it's still okay to have DevOps in your job title, but clearly we're past the phase where people think that you can just call yourself a DevOps and have that be a good thing. So when I say that DevOps is dead, what I really mean is that DevOps is in this trough right now. Or depending on how quickly your organization moves, you're sliding down there somewhere. But for a while, I didn't want to hear the term DevOps anymore. Everyone was saying yesterday that they kind of shy away from saying DevOps because it's a term that's become used and misused so many times that it kind of becomes meaningless. Some people use it to mean configuration management or agile or like the cloud's in there somewhere. DevOps, I mean, what does it even mean anymore? Some people, they were told that it was cool that they had to hire some DevOps or maybe implement the DevOps, just do the DevOps somehow. You keep using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means. So what's next? The slope of enlightenment in the hype cycle is when it becomes more widely understood how a technology or an idea can benefit the people or companies who are adopting it. Okay, so developers and operations working together. What else is there to understand? What is it really about? I would argue that when we're talking about DevOps, what we're really talking about, or what we should be talking about, is empathy. Empathy is the capacity to recognize, to understand, and to share another person's feelings and experiences. Empathy allows a developer to understand why the sysadmin craves reliability and doesn't want the site to go down. And it allows that same sysadmin to realize why the developer needs to release all those shiny new features. Empathy is what allows people to really work together. Jeff here actually wrote a really excellent blog post about this a few months back. And if you haven't read that, that's going to be part 2 of your homework. Go do that. I've got links on these slides, which I'll post later so you can go find it. He said, empathy allows software makers and operators to help each other deliver the best possible functionality and operability on behalf of their customers. And I think that's what's really important here, because after all, aren't our customers the people that we're ultimately thinking about? He also said, you can't design anything truly useful unless you understand the people for whom you're designing. This takes empathy one step further. We're not just having empathy for the different teams of people that we work with, but it's outside of the company, to the people that the company is trying to help with their product or service. I mean, how many products have flopped? How many startups have failed because somebody had an idea but didn't really understand their target audience well enough to see it through? At Game Changer, our target audience is the people involved in amateur sports, the players, the coaches and scorekeepers, and their families and friends. We have everyone in the company meet with and talk to our customers on a fairly regular basis so that those of us who aren't from a sports background can really understand and empathize the people that we're trying to help. I'm not a sports ball person myself. I don't really understand the ins and outs of baseball statistics. There's a lot of them, and they're complicated, as it turns out. But I do understand what it means for a coach to not have to spend hours calculating those by hand after every game. And I understand what it means for a grandfather to be able to follow along with his grandson's Little League game when he's in the hospital and can't make it to the game himself. We have our company values on a poster on the wall in our office. And the first one is customer first. Our CEO said to us, "I've never believed that words printed on a wall will create a strong culture, ensure business success, or win a championship for that matter, and these words are no exception. But I do hope that they can be a subtle reminder of the principles that we hope will be the foundation of a company that makes a positive difference in all of our lives and the lives of our customers." And that's what empathy is about for us. So how can we be more empathetic as people, as teams, or as companies? I mean, first of all, how do you even measure that? Joel Spolsky had the Joel test for software developers. Tom Limoncelli had the operations report card for sysadmins. So maybe one of you smart people will start putting together something for DevOps, a few key questions that can help us gauge how empathetic your company culture is. It's going to have to be something more complicated than just how many pull requests or deploys per day. Maybe something like, who is involved in planning various things? How much time is spent interacting with customers? How often do different teams actually really work together? If you're thinking about how to level up your DevOps or your empathy, it's really about culture. People would like to sell you tools because tools are a lot easier to sell you than cultural change. But the best automation or configuration management or fancy new text editor in the cloud, those things cannot fix a broken culture. It doesn't matter how well your shiny new Office chat system works if nobody uses it. Tools reinforce culture, and this can be either a good thing or a bad thing. I mean, we'd all agree that project management is a good idea, bug tracking is a good thing, but if each team uses a different tracking tool, how can you really expect that collaboration is going to happen? And I've seen that happen. It doesn't work, shockingly. Tools can reinforce trust and empathy between teams, or they can demonstrate its absence. I've seen places where different teams wouldn't give each other write access to their JIRAs or whatever because they didn't trust other teams not to put in bad cards for them. I've also seen places where teams didn't even have read access because for some reason they were that paranoid about the people that they were working with seeing what they were working on. So this is what DevOps is really about. It's more about the culture. It's not some new certification that you can show off. You can't just hire a DevOps and implement the DevOps so you can tell your investors that, hey, we did DevOps and we're going to make all the money now. It's about culture, and it's about empathy. So the last phase in the hype cycle is the plateau of productivity. This is when an idea starts to really take off, when its applicability and its relevance are really clearly understood. This is when we can take an idea that's more mature and start to really use it to make things better. So productivity. We know that what we want is a culture of empathy. So what productive steps can we take towards getting that kind of culture? It's not enough to just talk about it. You can't talk without any real productive action leads to the kind of places where they rename one of the teams the DevOps team, call it good, and then 6 months later they wonder why did nothing actually change. So what can we do? One thing we can do is stop creating DevOps teams. DevOps is about culture, and it doesn't make sense to have just one team or one director of DevOps be in charge of culture. Because one person, even if they're the CEO, can't change an entire company's culture on their own. It has to be a collective effort. Cultural changes have to have buy-in throughout the organization if they're going to succeed. It can't be just one team. And really, if you have just one team that's focused on collaboration and working well together, what are the rest of your teams doing? Are they trying to be jerks who don't talk to anyone? Coming back to empathy. Empathy allows you to view other teams as enablers rather than blockers. The developers, they don't want to take the site down. They're trying to enable the customers to enjoy new features to solve their problems better. And operations, sysadmins aren't trying to block the developers from getting any work done. We're just trying to enable a stable, manageable platform so that the customers can enjoy those shiny new features that the devs worked so hard on. Empathy allows us to tear down the traditional silos and instead encourages building trusting relationships between people and between teams. And remember that there's probably more teams in your company than just developers and operations. Any team can become a functional silo, can become walled off in the wrong environment. I mean, just because we as engineers say that we don't like marketing people sometimes doesn't mean that these other teams aren't providing value for the company. And if your devs and your ops are off in their own little land and marketing can't even get customer requests into the pipeline somehow, you've still got issues. DevOps started in a large part to try and solve the problems and dysfunctions that came from having isolated functional silos. These sorts of functional silos make it easier to pass responsibility out of them, to throw it over the wall and say, it's somebody else's problem, rather than encouraging people to take responsibility for themselves. I would argue, and other people in the community have said the same thing, that if your solution to DevOps is to just add a DevOps team, that's a bad idea and you're doing it wrong. If you have to hire a third team to enable two existing teams to talk to each other effectively, you may have made some bad hiring or cultural decisions along the way. Just saying. You don't have to go all the way to cross-functional teams everywhere. Depending on the size of your organization, that might not be realistic. But do consider how you can increase everyone's awareness and responsibility for their actions and for their work. Because responsibility and empathy go hand in hand. How can we encourage a culture of responsibility? One easy first step, if you haven't done this already, and you ops people will love this, put the developers on call. Make them understand, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, make them understand, here's your software is a thing that exists after you've finished writing it. When you see that there's the issues with it, it makes you responsible for the product that you've created. And trust me, after a couple weeks, the devs start to really understand why getting woken up at 4 a.m. when the site's on fire is a bad thing. And when these developers actually inevitably do get paged, make sure that the issues actually get fixed. Don't just say, oh, well, we got paged for an issue, but it's ops' problem to solve it now. Because that leads to something like this. It might be easy for a developer to look at this and say, well, it's ops' problem. I wrote my code and it's perfect. The site's up, I don't care. But this much red, not during an outage, which this was not, this is a systemic problem. This is not just an operations problem. This is indicative of what kind of baseline are you saying is acceptable, that there's this much alert fatigue? How much sleep are people missing, and why are you so okay with that? The thing to keep in mind is that different teams, different employees, are ultimately all part of the same company, all working towards the same end goals. Everyone shares the same successes and the same failures. DevOps is about figuring out how to work together without getting in each other's way towards these shared successes. Ultimately, what we're doing is we're creating solutions for people. Whether it's software or hardware, some web app or a mobile app, whether your customers are other businesses or individual end users, what we're trying to do is create things that solve problems for people. This means that the teams that we need to create need to share these values of empathy and responsibility. So how do we do that? Maybe we need to change how we interview and how we hire people. It's not enough to just hire rock stars that have technical skills and nothing else. We shouldn't hire people with that kind of mentality in development or ops or anywhere else in the company. At Game Changer, we have people interview not just with the team that they would be working on, but with other teams that they would be working with. We have engineering candidates interview with designers because engineering and design work together very closely. We're building the same product, and we need to know that the people that we're going to hire are going to be able to work well with people who aren't engineers. Okay, so once we have all of our awesome non-siloed teams and our non-rockstar employees, we can't just say that we've implemented DevOps and call it good. Just like our software and our hardware require maintenance and bug fixes and other continuous work to keep them from getting old and crufty, the same thing is true of our culture. In addition to technical debt, we can have cultural debt, like that screen of red that was just accepted as some normal baseline, that's just the way it is. The idea of blameless postmortems has been around for a while for technical incidents, where blameless is the idea, not that there are no consequences, that there's no responsibility, but that people should be allowed to speak up, should be encouraged to speak up without fear of consequences for speaking up. So that way you can figure out what actually is going on. We can do that for culture as well. When we have a hire or an interview that didn't work out, somebody whose values were not a good culture fit for the company, or an interview that turned out to be a waste of everyone's day, we actually post-mortem that. We say what went wrong in our screening process that allowed us to have an interview that wasn't a good use of anyone's time. Or we say what went wrong in our interviewing and our onboarding process that allowed a bad hire to be made. Because we want to continuously improve on our culture. On an individual level, we can contribute to growing this kind of culture by being the sort of engineer or the sort of person in general that other people want to work with. John Allspaw wrote a great blog post on this, and most of what it boils down to is being likable and approachable and getting things done. Nobody likes the person who does their work really well, but nobody can stand talking to them because they're kind of an asshole. But on the other hand, it really doesn't matter how much people like to get a beer with you after work if you don't get your work done. So try and be this kind of person. Try to say yes and enable things instead of just saying no. Don't be a bastard operator from hell or any other kind of person, developer, marketer. Don't be that jerk. Take responsibility for things. That means own problems and own their solutions. So it's been 5 years. Do we really still need a special word for working together without being assholes to each other? This wise 5-year-old from the internet thinks that maybe we don't. He says DevOps isn't hard. In fact, it's basically common sense. I mean, thank you, Jason, age 5. I think you're onto something. But maybe common sense ops just doesn't have the same ring to it. But we're in post-DevOps now, as Ben said, so we've got that going for us. But as long as the term is still around, we might as well try and keep learning from it. Continuously assess and develop your culture. Consider your customers and what you're trying to do for them. And practice empathy every single day. So long live DevOps, and long live empathy. Questions?
All right, Katherine, that was amazing. Thank you. I suspect that there are hands up, so we're going to get some questions going here. If there are people up on the upper level who have questions, we can maybe run a mic up there if one of my fellow organizers is around and can do that. Joe? Can you bring a mic up there?
All right, awesome talk. That's not a question.
Thank you.
That's imperative. So with the, back to when you made the statement about, obviously one person can't change the culture. So this is something that I've struggled with, right? Like, so how do you catalyze that, right? Because one person can't do it, right? Can't wake up and say, okay, today, new culture. But if we are like, well, I can't, how do you affect them against the message of saying, well, if one person can't do it, then I'm not going to do anything? Especially, and then the ultimate question to this is, can this culture change come bottom up, or must it come top down?
Yeah, I think that depends a lot on the organization and its size and its structure and whatever quirks it already has. On an individual level, I've seen people do things like decide, oh, I'm going to, open up, give read access or write access to this other team. On a very simple level, I've had people just start going to lunch with people from other teams to just, realize that these are people too. They're not just, some faceless email address that sends you tickets that you hate. I think that there can be definite change from the bottom up, but at some point I think you're probably going to have buy-in from the top. I don't have all of the answers to cultural change. If I did, I'd be a millionaire, but.
Yep, you sort of kind of answered my question already, but based on that last response. But I'm hearing a lot about just culture and a lot about the employees, and I'm just wondering, like, where does I really haven't heard this word often at this conference, but where does human resources fall into all of this? Are they a business partner at your company? Has anything been done in terms of like recruiting, like what competencies you're looking for? Is there training? Like, one thing I would maybe argue is that not everybody knows they're being an asshole. Sometimes you have to teach people they're being an asshole. So how do you deal with culture in that aspect, and where does human resources fit in?
Very true. That's a really good question. Right now we're small enough that we don't actually have HR, but we kind of have a culture of, everyone kind of holds each other accountable. So people feel comfortable, taking each other aside or going to, our kind of office manager, which is the closest thing we have to HR, and airing any problems that they might have. It's kind of hard to implement if you don't have it already, because nobody wants to be the first person who starts, tattletaling. As far as working with external business partners, I don't know. We've tried to. We're iterating on that process of how do you include people outside of your company. We've started just by trying to increase the amount of visibility that we can give them into our process, just so that they have an idea of what's going on. We can't necessarily, do everything that they want, but we can at least communicate what it is that we're both trying to do.
Hi, I'm way up here.
Hi.
Hi, Katherine. So how do you think having DevOps in your title relates to the fad of having rockstar or ninja or other select adjectives? Do you think that's more of a recruiting tool? Do you think it has value? I'm just trying to get your opinion on that.
I think it's definitely a way for recruiting to, be the same terrible way it is. My problem with like rockstar and ninja is that I think it encourages people who think only about themselves. I don't know, it just seems a little ridiculous to me to have it put in your job title that you play well with others. We've got one more up here.
I didn't see where it was, sorry. Fantastic. Okay, one more question.
Yeah, I paused something just as you turned away. seems to happen a lot. So as we think about integrating it across an organization, do you have any thoughts on using contractors as well as employees, and how do you integrate contractors who don't feel necessarily like a part of the organization into something like this?
Yeah, I've worked with contractors back in the day when I worked in corporate America and not at startups, and I think the most effective thing that we found was to try and include them in as much of the culture as possible. There were some teams who had contractors that never spoke to people about non-work related things. And like I said about going to lunch with people from other teams, just being able to interact with coworkers, with people on different teams or in different organizations as people, as individuals, really helps put a face on it.
All right, I think we're out of time. Thank you so much. Give it up again for Katherine. That was wonderful.